Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Chamberlain. I'm going to turn my camera on if I can. So hopefully you'll be able to see as well as hear me. And Josh has turned his camera on too. Hi, Josh. How are you doing?
Hi, Andy. I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good. Thank you. Thank you. So welcome to this webinar, which is all about IR35. We're doing a series of IR35 webinars at the moment because, of course, there's this big change which is imminently about to hit and is already having a big impact on people in the private sector. The particular webinar is all about how the market is reacting. So we've been doing a little bit of research, which we're going to talk about. And we've got some previous research that we did from the public sector. We're going to look at what firms are doing, what people are saying, and we want to also hear from you about your experiences. So please do use the questions box to tell us if you have a question. Do ask us a question. We'll try to answer your questions. But also, we'd love to hear just what's happening with you. Is your client spoken to you about IR35? Have they used the CES tool? Have they determined that IR35 applies? Are they saying it doesn't apply, perhaps? And we can try to cover that off towards the end of this and get a bit of a sense from the people who are on this webinar of what their experiences are. So without further ado, I'll just get cracking on with it. Oh, and if you could let us know in the questions box now that you can see and hear us okay, that's always very reassuring. We usually don't have any problems, so you should be able to both see Josh and I in the screen, hear what we're saying, and also see the slides that are in front of you. So just a quick recap. I know that everyone kind of knows this by now, but this whole rule change already happened in the public sector. So in 2017, the liability, the responsibility for working out whether IR35 applies, this whole headache of, does IR35 apply to any particular engagement, became the responsibility of the end client, in that case, public authorities. And then whoever was paying the contractor, the fee payer, had to make sure that tax was deducted at source, just as if they were paying an employee. That's what this change is all about. And what is happening now is that the private sector is being brought into line, as the government likes to say it, with the public sector. So we already had it going on there for the last 4 years, and now from this April, the rules will work broadly in the same way in the private sector. Now, there are some new things to this, and we've talked about that in previous webinars. We're not going to go over that too much, but broadly speaking, it is the same as what happened in the public sector is now happening in the private sector. How has the market reacted? So this is what this is all about. Now, these are the things that you'll have heard about, and we've heard about them too. What we don't know, what we've been trying to understand, is how much of this really applies. So, we know that some firms are doing what's known as a blanket ban. We saw this in the banking sector, and actually they did that last year when we thought the rules were coming in last April. They did it ahead of that, and they've just stuck with that policy despite the fact the rules haven't been in place for the last year. So we know a lot of the major banks, and we know lots of IPSE members work in the banking sector, did this thing where they said, we're not going to engage with this process at all. If anyone wants to come and work here from now on, they have to be on a payroll somewhere, quite often via an umbrella company. We will not engage, we will not pay any limited companies gross. And therefore, we don't have to determine their IR35 status because we're not paying them gross. So it's a way of sidestepping the rules. Disastrous for many contractors. Many people have had to close down their businesses. Also disastrous for many of those banks, I'd have thought, because they are going to be missing out on that resource. And we're going to talk a bit about the future at the end of this and what we think might happen, gazing into our crystal ball. We know that some clients are using CES. I was having an email with one IPSE member this morning, and they've just been informed by their client that the CES tool came back as undetermined. The CES tool is not perfect, and what the negotiations are from there. So we know lots of people are using, and sorry, CES, for those that don't know, is the Check Employment Status for Tax tool, which is a HMRC tool. It's on the government website. You can go on it. It is anonymous, so feel free to go and have a look at it. Your clients might be using it, and many of you will have already heard from your clients and know that they have used it. We think it's a flawed tool. One big problem with it is that it doesn't test for mutuality of obligation, which is one of the main factors within IR35. And I'll talk a bit about that towards the end of this webinar as well. We know that some people are using independent experts to do their determination process for them. So they're going out to an external resource saying, come into our firm and do our IR35 appraisals for us. That's not too bad. At least they're doing proper assessments that way. It's quite an expensive way for the client to do it. So not all clients have wanted to do that. Some will use a mixture of the above. Some are using their own internal testing. There are other tools out there as well, like I know that Grant Thornton have devised a tool. We know that our friend Dave Chaplin from Contractor Calculator and from Sheet has his product Shield, which is being used, which is another way of trying to devise a test to determine this. And then you might have heard too about things like contracted out services, statement of work. This is where, because of the way these rules work, it is possible that where you have what's known as a fully contracted out service, it removes the obligation from the end client to make that IR35 determination. And there's been talk, lots of talk, but I don't know how much of it's actually going into practice, of people rearranging their affairs so that they become contracted out services. There is a view that exists out there that if you have statement of work contracts in place, that can be helpful to establish that. I'm a little bit more skeptical about that, but I think it can be useful. I would say that with contracted out services and statement of work, it has to be a genuine arrangement. You can't just carry on as you were before, but just call it a contracted out service and put a statement of work contract in place. But that is one way to shift around that liability, which can be beneficial for all of the parties in the chain. Again, I would say we could see, as a market reaction to this, actually contractors genuinely offering their services in a slightly different way, perhaps a slightly more sophisticated way, which would be completely genuine and would nudge you away from the IR35 problem. And I think that's something that we're definitely interested in. I'd be interested in any thoughts anyone has on that on this webinar. There's talk of some insurance products going out there, but they're mainly targeting at the agencies, possibly at the end clients, not so much for the contractors themselves because they don't have any liability here. That's the problem. And then we know, of course, that many people, for the first time ever, are being asked to go and work via umbrella. We are doing a webinar on umbrella working next Thursday with Chris James from JSA. We're going to talk about all of that, all the realities of umbrella working, what it means. But for now, I would just say that one of the big concerns that we have about the push towards umbrella, apart from the fact we don't like the fact that people are having to do it against their will, is that umbrella companies are unregulated, and there are some perfectly compliant umbrella companies, but also some really non-compliant examples out there in the marketplace. So if you're seeing adverts from umbrella companies saying, you know, they'll give you 80 or 90% take-home pay, then it should be an alarm bell because they're probably not being tax compliant. And it's possible that that could end up being your problem some years down the line, as we've seen with the loan charge and some real horror stories there that many of you will be aware of. So as I say, we'll talk about umbrella companies in more detail next week on this webinar. So do tune into that if that's something that interests you. I'm going to hand over to Josh now, who's going to talk us through a bit about IPSE's previous research and more recent research that we've done in this area. So over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Andy. So previous research, we know from our previous research that concern for IR35 has consistently been high for freelancers, particularly limited company directors. From our February 2020 report, we found that 2/3 of limited company directors, of freelancers, were worried about the changes. And for limited company directors, this actually rose to 88%. Similarly, in our latest Freelancer Confidence Index for the last quarter of 2020, the two most highly skilled freelancer SOC groups reported that government tax policy, rather than the pandemic was the leading adverse factor affecting their business, showing the real concern from freelancers on the upcoming changes and also the stark impact the proposed reforms were having already on a lot of freelance businesses. So moving on to the last bullet point, conducted by a government behavioural insights team, this impact assessment for HMRC actually found that the April rollout of IR35 reforms would see freelancers actually wanting significantly more information about what the reforms would mean for tax obligations. So HMRC must be aware of these concerns that contractors have, and yet sadly that they still seem to be pushing ahead with these reforms. Can I have the next slide, please, Andy? Perfect. So what are clients telling contractors? Nearly 1 in 4 contractors said their clients were planning to blanket assess all their contractors as inside IR35. And this roughly equates to what we've seen in other research that we'll go back to later on, and also from a website that we're quite interested to assess further, the off-payroll website, but we'll touch on that in a bit. 1/5 of clients had also told contractors that they would only engage contractors who, 1/5 of clients had also told contractors that they would only engage contractors who are operating through an umbrella company. And alarmingly, nearly 1 in 10 clients were planning to cease engaging contractors altogether. In effect, a blanket ban on all contractors, again indicating the potentially devastating impact of the reforms. Similarly, 16% of clients have said that they will use external experts to make the IR35 assessment, and 17% have not indicated what they will do after the introduction of the reforms, perhaps showing that a considerable proportion of clients still remain unaware of the reforms, which could lead to further problems down the road. Can I have the next slide, please, Andy? Perfect. So how are contractors reacting? The survey that we've recently conducted also focused on how contractors were planning to operate post-April. So as a result of the reforms, over half, 56% of all freelancers were only willing to continue contracting if they can find contracts deemed to be outside IR35. This in turn could have a knock-on effect with potential for rates to fall as contractors potentially lower their prices in order to secure contracts in a more competitive market. An extremely high 24% were planning to seek contracts abroad, which not only highlights just how concerned contractors are, but this would also be a significant blow to the UK economy and its recovery post-COVID. 12% of contractors were planning to stop working altogether, 17% planning on seeking an employed role, and 11% will simply retire within the next year. So this survey, I think it was just under 2,000 freelancers that we polled, does show concerning findings for how the reforms will impact on contracting going forward. And then finally, the next slide, please, Andy. Going forward, there is a very useful resource we found on the website. This website here, Off Payroll. So this website acts as a site where contractors can report the IR35 position of clients and their experience with these clients in industries across the board. So if you do have experiences to share or wish to access or assess an IR35 position of a client before taking on an engagement, I would highly recommend using this site if you're not already, as it is a very useful resource. And I've just pulled out some interesting client positions on IR35 from this website. So from what contractors are saying, it seems clients such as Leeds City Council and DS Smith are performing largely fair assessments. I mean, you might differ with these responses, but these are what contractors are saying. So they seem to be assessing specific project delivery requirements, assessing contractors individually, and also using the CES tool to determine IR35 status, however controversial that tool may be. But then we look at larger clients, the picture from contractors changes quite drastically. Contractors are reported clients such as BP and National Grid have implemented a blanket ban on all contractors inside IR35, and others such as IBM and even the Scottish Government are only accepting contractors operating through an umbrella company. It's interesting to see reports that the Scottish government is actually requiring the use of an umbrella company, as this once again demonstrates the failure of the reforms in the public sector, which are soon to be implemented in the private sector, as we all know. But I'm sure Andy will go into more detail on the public sector experience in a bit. Obviously, some of you may have different experiences with these clients, but the feedback here on this website does seem to show a concerning trend of larger clients either implementing a blanket ban or requiring contractors to operate through an umbrella company.
And as Josh says, that's a good website. Many of you might have already seen it and possibly interacted with it and put your own reviews on there. But if you in the future, when you're going to get a new contract with a certain client, you can go on there and see if anyone's talked about how they're implementing the IR35 reforms. As Josh says, it's not all bad news. There are some positive reports on there of fair assessments being done, but there's a lot of there's a lot that aren't like that. And I can already see coming in the comments, Rachel and Anthony have both said that their clients just gone with the blanket ban approach, which I talked about before. Others reporting about the CES tool being used. Stevens just said that he had an outside determination originally, but then that was overturned by a blanket inside. So, everyone's suddenly inside. And talking about the challenge, you can challenge a client's determination. You have a right to do that, but it's a bit of a weak sort of ability. It's a bit of a weak right in a way, because the client will say, yeah, okay, we see your challenge there. We've now got 45 days to respond under the legislation, at which point we're either going to come back and issue you a new status determination statement, probably an outside one, or we're just going to stick to the same one. And there's nothing that makes them there's nothing in the legislation which makes them have to reason their way through that process. So you could put to them the most compelling argument that they've got their decision wrong and that IR35 should not apply. And there's nothing which makes them have to accept that evidence. They can just say no. And as long as they've done that, been through that process and allowed you to make that challenge, they've satisfied their obligations under the legislation. So, and we've said all along that that's not good enough, and that there should be some access to some independent arbitration service, the courts, even HMRC, IPSE, anyone. But then the trouble is, it would just be such a huge amount of resource required to do that it's impractical actually. But it's remained deeply unfair. Okay, let's move on a bit with the. So I wanted to talk about. We also know a bit about what happened in the public sector, because in 2008, it was actually the end of 2018. We were in the field with this, and we launched it. Sorry, end of 2017. So just after the public sector rules had come in. We did some research with CIPD, Chartered Institute of Professional Development. We asked the contractors that you can see there what their experiences were, and they asked some hiring managers. It wasn't designed like this, but it turned out lots of the people who responded were NHS trusts, and we know, we've talked about it on this webinar before, that the NHS had some particularly vociferous problems with the IR35 implementation. A group of doctors got together and actually launched a pre-action protocol for a judicial review against NHS improvement, which is a sort of overseeing body of the NHS trust. 31% of the contractors that we asked said that they had been working in the public sector, but they were not afterwards, and over 2/3 of those attributed this to the IR35 rules. So one of the things that we have to bear in mind when we look through this, and I'm going to rattle through it quite quickly, is that of course, when the public sector rules came in, there was this whole private sector that contractors that did have those transferable skills could go and work in and just say, if my client's going to start, deciding my IR35 status, I'm out of here. I'm just going to go and work for some clients that aren't going to do that. Now we don't have that. So there's nowhere to go unless you go abroad, which, we've just seen some people are thinking about. There's nowhere really to go within the UK to escape now this new reality of IR35. But anyway, just to sort of talk through this. So when we asked, why did you leave? Contractors would say things like, they knew the rules were coming in, So they just left, and that was 38% of them. Another 30% said, well, my contract was going to end prior to the change. I ensured that my contract would end prior to the changes coming in. I wasn't signing any contracts with public sector clients that were going to take me over that April 2017 deadline. And some others, their contracts ended naturally, and then they just decided not to find another contract in the public sector. And some of them even found 6% of them said that their clients terminated the contract before it was due to end because the clients were so worried about the IR35 problems. Hiring managers backed this up too. 75% of them said it had become harder to recruit contractors into the public sector after the IR35 changes came in, and 71 said it had been harder to retain contractors. So there was a big problem in the public sector. Basically, there was an exodus of skilled contractors. Quite a lot of information on this slide, and you will be sent a recording of this so you can look back over it at your leisure. But probably the one there is, we've lost skilled contractors. 51% of hiring organisations said that they'd lost skilled contractors as a result. A quarter of them talked about projects being delayed. And look at that top one there too. Many of them had seen more use of contractors from large consultancies. This is one of the great bugbears that we have put to the government, that these IR35 rules create an unfair advantage for the big boys, the big players in this market, because they can get around these rules because of the way they structure their affairs. So it now means that when you're touting for business, it makes KPMG and PwC look more attractive to an end client than the one-man band contractor, because for the one-man band contractor, they know they've got to do an IR35 assessment, which is a nightmare, which no one wants to do, and they may well get into a row over that with the contractor, and it could all become very difficult. So, we did see that happening in the public sector, and we're keeping an eye on this to see if that happens in the private sector as well. Workload associated with engaging contractors. This is quite an important point, because all the hiring organisations that we asked, 80% of them said there's now more hassle. It's more hassle to engage a contractor than it was before. And we are coming out of the worst recession we've had for 100 years or something. And what we want is firms to be able to quickly pick up as we come out of that and to drive the economy onwards. We want them to have easy access to flexible resource, which is expert and which can get projects done. And that's what the contractor workforce does. It's a great thing for the UK economy that we have a vibrant contractor workforce. And these rules are a huge dampener on that. They really dampen that advantage. We have said this to government repeatedly, and they are so obsessed with bringing these rules in, come what may, that the message doesn't seem to have got through. But we really do think that if we're going to come out of this recession as quickly as we possibly can, we need less barriers in place between firms engaging contractors, because that's what helps to sort of get the ball rolling with the economy. That sort of takes me nicely onto the sort of crystal ball gazing part of the webinar. There is a long-term trend towards more self-employment. So when I say self-employment, I do mean the whole of the sort of the biggest sense of the word. So I include within that limited company contractors, but also sole traders. The ONS, when they look at their statistics on self-employment, they include both limited company contractors and self-employed sole traders as well. So self-employment is really just a way of saying people who are basically out there working for themselves, whether they decide to structure that via a company or they do it just as a sole trader or even via a partnership. They are not employees, but they are still working. What we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years is a steady rise in the number of self-employed people taking up a larger percentage of the labour market. And after the last recession, the financial crisis, we saw a surge in the number of self-employed people. And we also know that a lot of them were forming companies because there's been a surge in the number of incorporations, particularly incorporations with just one director. So all of that points to more and more people coming into self-employment. Now, the ONS stats show that we had at the start of this year, the start of last year, 2020, we had 5.1 million self-employed people in the UK. That's now down to about 4.45 or 4.5. So we've lost 600,000. Now, the ONS is saying that possibly what could be going on here, because data is very hard to collect in this area, that the previous figure was being exaggerated, that some people were reporting they were self-employed when they perhaps weren't, and that during the course of the pandemic, that's become more apparent. But I think that we definitely will have seen a drop in the number of self-employed people because we've had the recession. And when you get a recession, those who are working for themselves, who are easier for the firms that they were working for to get rid of them, get rid of them. And then they may decide to drop out of self-employment because they couldn't pick up more work. There's also been a lack of support for certain sectors of the self-employed market, especially company directors. They have not been well supported during the pandemic, not as well supported as some other groups, such as employees or even sole traders. And even amongst sole traders, there are some groups that haven't been well supported. There's also this thing going on, and we've had some questions about this already in the chat today, about what's going on with the courts and the unions. There's been a drive over the last few years, which is beginning to sort of culminate now in some big decisions. And yesterday we had the news that Uber has decided that all of its drivers are no longer self-employed. They are now going to be workers with worker status, all as a result, of course, of the Supreme Court decision, which we got 3 weeks ago. And the unions are stirring that up. They're driving this and pushing this into the courts, and the courts are sort of rounding on self-employment and saying, well, we don't think this is appropriate, we don't like it. You know, we're going to try to start saying that some people who we thought previously were self-employed, in fact, are not self-employed. I mean, I'm slightly putting words into their mouths. I think the Supreme Court would have said, when looking at that Uber case, that they were never really self-employed, that Uber were incorrectly categorizing that group as self-employed, and they could well be right. But there is a bit of a sense at the moment that the establishment, the institutions of this country don't like the growth in self-employment that we've seen. And so they want to try to sort of push it back in towards something else, pushing it back in towards employment, basically. And that's kind of what IR35 is doing too, but just from a tax point of view, not from a rights point of view. IR35 is really all about the fact that governments are nervous about the growth of self-employment. They don't really like it. They're worried about the erosion of the tax base, for one thing, and that's what IR35 is all about. They're looking at that steep rise in the number of incorporations and the number of one director incorporations, and they're saying, hang on a minute, if this is all people that were previously employed and are now working in this way, that means we're missing out on some tax. And actually what they're missing out on really is national insurance and employer national insurance. And that's what this is all about. It's all about employer national insurance, and it's all about getting people onto the payroll. The government loves the payroll. The payroll taxes people automatically, and it hands the money over to the tax man in pretty much real time. You know, you earn some money this month, by the end of the month, the tax man's got a chunk of it. And in fact, before you have any of it, the tax man's got a chunk of it, or at least at the same time. That's how they want everyone to pay tax. And they don't like it when more and more people slip away from that and go off and earn some money and then have to do their tax return and pay the tax, you know, maybe the following January. They don't like that. That's not how they want people to be paying their tax. So IR35 is all about getting people onto the payroll, come what may. Now, this is the cynic in me speaking. This is not what the government would say. The government would say it's all about making sure that there's full compliance with the already existing IR35 rules. And it's about ensuring that the great line that some of you might have written to your MP, because we've asked you to do that recently, and thank you for doing that. And some of you might have written to your MP on more than one occasion, because we've asked you to do it several times. We just really feel it's important to get the message into the government that this is having a really bad impact on people's businesses. But many of you, when you've written to your MP, will have received a response back either directly from the Treasury and the Chancellor, or perhaps Jessie Norman, the Financial Secretary, or from your MP themselves. And there's a line in there that says, it's IR35 is all about ensuring that two people doing broadly the same work who are sat next to each other are paying tax in broadly the same way. Well, that skims over the fact that in fact maybe they're not doing the work in the same way, and one of them has a totally different employment status to the other one, and in fact there are two different tax systems at play here. And on top of that, in fact, what IR35 is doing is it means that people who are not doing work in the same way as employees are being taxed like employees, because the clients are nervous, as we've seen, the blanket decisions and all of that. So governments are definitely trying to look at ways to suppress this natural explosion of self-employment which is going on. As I say, some of it will be incorporated, limited company contractors, and some of it is unincorporated, but it's all growing. It's all growing, and it's all part of the same sort of phenomenon. What happens as we emerge from this recession will be enlightening, because we saw this huge surge, as I say, after the financial crisis last time. And will these dampening attempts by the courts and by the government to try to sort of suppress that a bit, will that actually suppress it, or will it explode out of it anyway? We are seeing this long-term trend towards it. I believe that we're going to continue to see that. I believe that clients will, over time, begin to take a more nuanced approach to IR35 assessments. I think right now they're panicked. I think that, although I wasn't involved in this area at the time, when the initial IR35 rules came in the year 2000, a lot of contractors thought, because this was all on them then, of course, a lot of contractors thought this is the end of contracting. I can't contract anymore because HMRC is clamping down on it with these IR35 rules. And actually what the contractors realized over time is that they could get their heads around the legislation, they could get something in place like insurance or maybe PCG or IPSE membership, and they could try to organize their affairs so that they can carry on working in this way, living with this risk that they don't want, that we've been campaigning to get rid of, but living with the risk that HMRC might drag them through a pretty horrendous investigation, but still carrying on working in this way regardless. And I think that clients might actually come around to that point of view as well over time. Right now they're in that panic stage, but I believe that they may well come out of that and begin to realize that they need contractors, that they need them to be working outside of IR35. They don't want to treat them like employees. They want their projects done. The good contractors don't want to accept IR35. And if one bank decides that they're definitely not going to use contractors in that way, but another bank says that they will, then all the good contractors will go to that bank, and all of a sudden the other banks are at a disadvantage. So that's my hope. It's an optimistic vision of what might happen, but that is what I believe. I could be wrong. My crystal ball has been not working very well lately. It didn't predict the pandemic and other things. So we'll see. We'll see if I'm right or not. This is the last slide, then we're going to get on to doing more from your questions and your comments as well. The tribunals are still going on in the background. So old-fashioned IR35 was all about a contractor being dragged into a tribunal by HMRC and having a big row over whether or not IR35 should have applied to a engagement, probably one that ended some time ago, and we're now looking back in time. That's still happening, and there's been a couple of interesting tribunals, and I think that they're really causing problems for the way that HMRC and the government foresee these new rules working, and I'll just explain that a little bit here. So Kay Adams is a TV presenter and radio presenter. She is possibly best known as being one of the prominent loose women on the show Loose Women, but she also had a show on the BBC a while back called The Kay Adams Show. It might be still going on, you can tell, I don't know. But HMRC investigated her for that engagement with the BBC, and they said that IR35 should have applied. They took her to a tribunal. The BBC weren't in the dock here because it predated the public sector change. She won at the first tier tribunal because she was in business on her own account. I've missed the hyphen off there between own and account, forgive me. She was in business on her own account. Now, HMRC appealed that decision, and the upper tier tribunal has recently upheld the first tier tribunal, saying, no, IR35 does not apply because Kay Adams is in business on her own account. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this here is because the way that these new rules work is they make the client make the IR35 decision. And indeed, there is a sort of vision of this, that, you know, how it will work as we step beyond the April kind of crossover date, where you've got existing engagements going on and clients now having to make a view about an existing engagement. In the future, the client is going to say, right, we need a contractor, let's do an IR35 assessment before we go and advertise that, and then we can advertise it as being either inside or outside of IR35. In fact, it'd be very useful if they could do that, because then contractors will know before they come into it what the treatment is going to be. However, if it is important, not just important, but in the Kay Adams case, it was the most crucial factor of the IR35 assessment, was whether or not Kay Adams was in business on her own account. Then how is the end client going to know that before they've even met the contractor? And even if they do have the contractor there, they don't have a 360 view of what's going on inside that contractor's business. And the contractor might not want to share too much of that information with them. It could be commercially sensitive. So how is the end client ever going to really know whether IR35 applies if the experience of what's going on inside that contractor business is determinative in establishing the IR35 status of that engagement? So that's one case that I think does raise some serious questions about how these rules work. The other one is the referees case. It's the Professional Game Match Officials Limited versus HMRC, but everyone calls it the referees case. And that case all comes down to mutuality of obligation. So that case is all about, so HMRC have taken a view on mutuality of obligation, which is, we believe, quite extreme. They say that anytime there's a contract in place, mutual obligations apply. They're basically saying a contract says one party has to do some work for the other, and the other party has to pay the other. Both obliged to do it. There is mutual obligations, mutuality of obligation applies. That's the HMRC view of what mutuality of obligation means. But over the years, consistently, the courts have pushed back on that view, and they have said, no, the mutual obligations have to extend beyond just that, because in order for it to be established as a employment type relationship. There's one case called Eustech versus Young, where the judge said something along the lines of, this notion that anytime there's a contract, there's mutual obligations, and therefore mutuality of obligation applies, and therefore the engagement is one of employment, is clearly nonsense, because it could very well be one for freelance services. So that case really did set that out. Now, the referees case went to the first tier tribunal. The referees won, HMRC's lost, and they won it on mutuality of obligation, which rubbished HMRC's view of mutuality of obligation. HMRC appealed, and they took it to the upper tier tribunal. The upper tier upheld the first tier tribunal view, again rubbishing HMRC's view on mutuality of obligation. Now, at that stage, it should have set precedent. HMRC should now take that on and say, yeah, well, we've now got this ruling which kind of says that our view on this isn't right, and it's been applied by a higher court. But they're saying, no, the judge has erred. We're going to appeal it again. It's going to go to the Court of Appeal. I think that must be happening really soon, but I'm not quite sure where it is in the system. I think that will be really interesting to watch, because if the Court of Appeal uphold the upper tier tribunal and the first tier tribunal view, then HMRC will only have the Supreme Court to go to, and they may well decide to go to it, and then we really will get a view on this mutuality of obligation thing. The reason this is important, apart from the fact that, well, for lots of reasons it's important, but it's important because HMRC do not test for mutuality of obligation in their CESS tool, as I mentioned earlier. It's a critical flaw in the tool, in our opinion, and yet masses of you, thousands of contractors are out there right now having their engagements determined by that tool, and we have the court saying you have to test for mutuality of obligation, and that tool doesn't do it. So I think we have a lot of wrong determinations going on as a result of that tool being used. And this case, the referees case, is going to be really important in establishing this. So the tribunals are still causing problems for IR35 and the way that the government want it to work in the future. I think that's probably about the end of our slide deck there. We're going to have a bit of a, how much, oh good, we've got 20 minutes to go, so we're going to refer to your questions, but just before we get onto that, that QR code you can see in front of you there, if you hold your phone up against it, that will take you to our feedback form, I think we had a problem with this a couple of weeks ago, but it's all sorted now. So please do leave us your feedback. We'd love to get your feedback. It's really important for us to know so we can design future webinars and work out what we're not doing as well as we could do. And we really like doing these webinars. We want them to be as useful as we can for you. So please leave your feedback. And there's a couple of links there as well. I'll leave this up on the screen while we talk about some questions. Have you noticed any, Josh, that we could get straight into?
I've got a couple already. John is asking, if a client only uses the CES tool and nothing else to determine IR35 status, can this be challenged?
So you can challenge your client's determination, however they come to that determination. You have a right to say to them, I disagree with your determination. What we would advise you to do when you challenge it is to submit some evidence which backs up your challenge. The ways that you can do that are, you could go and do the CES tool yourself and print that off and say, look, I've done the CES tool too, and it says I'm outside of IR35. But that will all come down to the fact of how those questions have been answered. And there may be disagreements there. Ultimately, it is the client's decision on how they answer those questions for their own assessment. This is their assessment that they're doing. You could also get your contract reviewed. You can do that via IPSE's contract review service, but other services are available. And you could present that to them and say, look, the contract review, this independently done contract review, and they can also test for your working practices as well. You fill out a questionnaire. You could say to them, this shows that this engagement is outside of IR35. You could even invite your client to do that process with you and possibly get them to pay for it as well. You could say, look, I don't think you've got this right. The CES tool isn't working. I know that the CES tool is very flawed, but there's a lot of skepticism about it. It's not just IPSE that say they don't like the CES tool. There's lots of experts. If you Google around it, you'll find people saying why the CES tool is flawed. So you could say to them, why don't we go and do a contract review service together, and we'll get this independent arbitration coming in. It'll be an independent assessment, and we'll see what they have to say about the IR35 status. But the client doesn't have to do that. Or you just simply pull together your own documentation, which shows you believe that you're outside of IR35. What you're looking for is any evidence that you are not working like an employee. So, what differentiates you from employees in the client firm? Do you have a right to send the substitutes? Is that in your contract? You can point that out to them. Do you have a lot of autonomy in how you do your work? That's really important. Do you have control over how the work is done? Point this out to them, because if you've got strong level of control, or even if you don't, if you have a right to substitute, which is an unfettered right, or if there are no mutual obligations, that's a hard one to actually get your head around and prove. But either, if you have any of those things in your favor, IR35 should not apply. Plus, you've got the business on own account thing, so you can think about trying to say to them, look, I'm running a business here. I've got other clients, I've got other revenue streams, I've got my own website, I've got my own business plan, I've got my own marketing plan. I'm not an employee. Unfortunately, the client does not have to take any of that on board. All they have to do is say, thanks very much, we'll consider your challenge, and then come back to you in 45 days. And if they want to, just say, we're sticking with our initial decision, but thanks very much. And there's nowhere you can go from there. So it's not, as I said it before, it's a bit of a weak right. But look, if your client is reasonable and you have a strong case to say that IR35 does not apply, you should challenge and you should try and persuade them of your arguments that you are right and that IR35 does not apply. I hope that's answered that question. Anything else, Josh, that you've noticed?
Claire is saying that a friend of hers was given an SDS outcome of indeterminate. Is that legal?
No, it's not. No. So probably what's happened there is that Claire's friend has had I don't mean to say that sounding like I don't doubt that it is your friend, Claire. I'm sure it is your friend. A friend of mine said, no, I'm not saying that at all. I think what's happened there is that the client here has used the CES tool. The CES tool has come back and said it's indeterminate, which it's prone to do in about 15% of cases. So then the client has said, well, that's the SDS, but that's not the SDS. The status determination statement has to say clearly whether IR35 applies or not. It can't say we're not sure, otherwise it's not an SDS. The SDS also has to show the reasons why they have decided IR35 applies, and they have to take reasonable care when coming to that decision. If the client does all three of those things, then they have satisfied their obligations basically under the legislation. They have provided an SDS. But if they give you an SDS that says we don't know, that's not an SDS. So no. But it all depends on what they're planning to do from there, though, I suppose, Claire. Because if the client's saying, well, we're not sure, if your friend can turn back to them and say, in that case, let's just carry on outside of IR35, then fine. I mean, go for that. But their client is a bit exposed there because they haven't actually provided an SDS, and that could mean that the tax liability will fall to them if HMRC ever come knocking at their door. I can see. Go ahead.
Philip's found or seen a novel solution for getting around the reforms. He's seen contractors pairing up to form joint companies in order to convince clients that they are not PSCs.
Yeah. That is interesting. I mean, so what do I say about that? Look, if you can find a way to convince your client that IR35 doesn't apply to your engagement, then first of all, good for you. There's nothing wrong with that as far as I'm concerned. And actually, it doesn't, because of the way these rules have changed, the liability won't fall back to the contractor under any circumstances. So there's that. I think that a lot of clients, though, would not accept that as a reason for them not to do a IR35 assessment. A PSC, a personal service company, is a made-up term. There's no legal standing. It's just a limited company like any other company. Now, if you have two directors inside a limited company, both fee earning, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that at all. But each one of those fee earners is going to go off to an engagement. And that engagement under this new legislation has to be assessed for IR35, assuming the end client isn't small. If the end client is small, then the PSC or limited company has to do that assessment and the liabilities on them. But assuming that end client isn't small, so those two fee earning directors that have paired up and formed one company are going to go off and do their own separate things with separate clients. Each one of those engagements has to be assessed for IR35. The fact that there is two of them inside the PSC really makes no difference at all under this legislation. However, if this is bamboozling clients enough to make them say, oh, fine then, we don't worry about IR35, then chapeau, good for you, great. But those clients may get wind of this at some point and realize that, oh no, actually we do need to do an IR35 assessment here. There is another thing that's going on here that Philip's sort of alluding to a bit as well, which is some people are wondering, because of the contracted out services thing that I talked about at the beginning, the way that these rules work is that, I'll just give this example that I always give. So if you have a bank that decides they want to have some catering services provided at lunchtime for their staff, they will go to a catering company. The catering company will come in and it will make food happen. And that is a contracted out service. Now, if the catering company is engaging contractors, it is up to the catering company to do those IR35 assessments. It's got nothing to do with the bank. The bank is simply saying, I just want you to go and I want you to provide this service. I'm staying out of how you staff that. That's up to you. I just want the service to be done. The bank does not have to do, even though the bank is sort of the end client in a way, people working inside that catering company, the bank doesn't have to worry about their IR35 assessments. The catering company does. Now, the catering company might be a small company, in which case they get the small company exemption. So all of a sudden they don't have to do it either. It's back to being the individual contractors inside that catering company. So that's a fairly clear example of a contracted out service that we'd all agree is a contracted out service. But what if the bank decides it wants to do a little bit of banking on the side, and it decides it's going to go to a consultancy that have some bankers within it, and they're going to come into the bank via that consultancy and do a bit of work there. Now, HMRC might say, hang on a minute, that's not really a contracted out service. That's just you using this consultancy to get these bodies in to do some work for you. they're going to say that consultancy is more like acting like an agency in this supply chain. They're just one link in the supply chain, which is linking you, the end client, up with those individuals doing the work. That's where it gets complicated. The rules over contracted out services are just as complicated as working out, is it a contracted out service or isn't it? That's just as complicated as working out whether IR35 should apply or not, if you ask me. So there are some people talking about, let's form a consultancy and we'll go and offer our services as a contracted out service. Now, I think there could be some genuine compliant ways to do that, but I think this is definitely a grey area that I think we might get some court cases on this in years to come to work out what's a contracted out service and what isn't. But I do know that this is happening in the market, or at least I'm hearing it is. But I hear people talking about how they might do it, but I have heard less about people saying, I'm actually doing it. We know that before the IR35 rules came in, there were consultancies that did do this, and they've always, I've spoken to quite a few of them, they're not sure about how this will impact them. But I think that they're going to take the view for the time being that they are providing an outsourced service in most cases. If the end client accepts that, that's fine. But if the bank turns around to the consultancy and says, actually, we've got to do IR35 assessments on all these people, that's when you're going to get in some difficulties. Is it a contracted out service or isn't it? Because that shifts who has the responsibility for making that IR35 decision. Okay, anything else, Josh?
Alan is saying that you just described the exact situation he's in, but the client has decided that it wants all staff working for the catering company to be on PAYE to avoid any chance of liability.
Yeah, exactly right. So, and this is the problem, is that we don't know, because the contracted out service provisions are complicated. When is it a contracted out service and when isn't it? In this case, in Alan's case, the end client is saying, I don't know either. It looks a bit complicated. There could be a risk here. Everyone's just got to go on PAYE or you don't get the gig. And this is the problem with these rules. It's all about pushing people into PAYE. And if there's any doubt, push them onto PAYE. That's what the market is basically doing here. So contractors and IPSE are trying to help them find ways, and trying to persuade clients as well, find ways that we can actually arrange our affairs so that IR35 doesn't apply and you don't need to worry about it because someone else is, because we've got this, all our ducks in a line here and this is perfectly compliant. And I think that there will be ways emerging of that. But at the moment, as I said before, we're in this phase where clients are just panicking, just like IR35 applies, everyone's got to be on the payroll, not interested in hearing any other ways around it. But there are ways around it, compliant ways around it, not oh, we're going to get around this, we'll find a little loophole, fully compliant ways to do this. Now, IR35 doesn't apply to every engagement under the sun. Even HMRC said, I think about 2 years ago, they came up with something. I'll try and dig this out maybe for the next webinar that we do. HMRC said that they thought that around about 35%, I think it was, of engagements which were currently out there at that time were caught by IR35. Their problem was that only around 10% of engagements were actually operating within the IR35 rules, which left this gap of about 25% of engagements that should have been inside IR35, which weren't being, which is why they decided to do this. But what we're seeing now is something close to like 80% of engagements being deemed to be inside IR35. So it's clear there's massive over compliance going on here. And even HMRC will be aware of that. But the cynic in me says they're quite happy about it because they get everyone on the payroll, they get the tax quicker, they get more of it. Everyone's happy. Well, not everyone's happy, they're happy. So yeah, but no, thanks Alan for that feedback. It's really interesting to hear. I can see Colin has said that his client has issued an SDS which says that the engagement is deemed outside of IR35. Good news, Colin, well done. So it's good to get those positive stories back as well. Not everyone is getting inside. It's possible to work outside IR35, and good on that client, because Colin says they've used an external expert, Kingsbridge. They've used Kingsbridge to come in and do the assessments. I think where you see clients doing that, and you've got external experts like Kingsbridge, there are others out there, like Markel, who we work with, will do that as well. Where clients are doing that, you're definitely getting a sense that there's a fairer assessment being done. And more often than perhaps would otherwise be the case, they're saying IR35 doesn't apply here. They're then giving a stamp of approval to that client to say, no, we've checked it out thoroughly, IR35 doesn't apply. That client then feels emboldened to issue that SDS, And if HMRC come knocking, they can say, yeah, well, we checked it all out properly. We used some external experts. This is what they had to say about it. So yeah, it's an interesting one, Colin. Thanks for that feedback. Anything else you've noticed, Josh?
Keith is asking, if a contractor has an unfettered substitution clause, is this a watertight case for being outside of IR35?
Yes, it should be. Yes, is the answer. It has to be more than just a clause in the contract. It has to be actually enforceable. The difficulty that contractors are coming up against is that if clients, you might have that in your contract, but if the client decides, let's say the client's going to do the CES tool, there's one question in the CES tool, which I've talked about in other webinars. I've got a screenshot of it in a different slide deck. It says, the client is asked, do you have a right to reject a substitute? Yes or no, with a bit of confusingly worded blurb underneath, which I think could be a lot better. The client then has, if they say, no, I don't have a right to reject a substitute, you've got a good chance of that CES tool coming out and saying that IR35 does not apply. If the client says, yes, I can reject a substitute, then the CES tool is almost certainly going to say that IR35 applies. And if you work very hard at answering all the other questions in the best way possible from an outside of IR35 point of view, you might get a can't determine result. But you're going to struggle to say client says they can reject a substitute and the tool says it's outside of IR35. Someone on here in the chat a couple of weeks ago said to me they've worked out a way to get the tool to do that. And the client says I can reject a substitute, but still answer other questions in a certain way to get outside. But I'm telling you, it is not likely to happen. So yes, the question was, if you genuinely have a unfettered right to send a substitute, and the client agrees with that, and when they do the CES tool, they will say, yeah, no, I can't reject a substitute. There's an unfettered right here. Then IR35 will not apply. The CES tool will say it won't apply, and a tribunal would say it wouldn't apply either. The trouble is that does the client really see it that way? Because, from a client's point of view, if you're confronted with that question, Andy Chamberlain's working happily away at some client or other. And if I come in one day and say, oh yeah, I'm sending in this substitute, here he is, and he's a raving lunatic, the client's going to say, well, you can't send them in. So this is where it gets difficult. Is the client really going to just accept any old substitute I give them? By the way, they can reject a substitute on the grounds that they're not qualified to do the job, or that they don't meet their vetting procedures, and that still means you have a right to substitute. And this is where that wording in that blurb, I think, could make that more clear. But clients are mainly, I think, going to be erring on the side of saying, like, no. If I really don't like that substitute, then they can't send them, and that's the problem. But yes, technically speaking, unfettered right to substitution means no IR35. That's the way it works. You don't have to worry about mutuality or obligation or control or in business your own account. You've got an unfettered right to substitute, there's no IR35. But that's technically. In practice, a bit more tricky. What else have we got here? I've seen some comments from Ian. GSK is refusing to take on anyone outside of IR35, including, I think that says, for consultancies providing services to them. Fixed term contracts is the only model acceptable to GSK. Yeah, I know GSK have done this. GSK have got a special relationship with IR35. You may know, Ian, that about a year ago, they were written to by HMRC and then wrote to all their. HMRC wrote to all these GSK contractors and started asking them about their IR35 status. It was a sort of a kind of out the blue kind of attack on GSK contractors, and GSK clearly was sort of spooked by that. There's also been previous cases involving GSK, former, quite possibly still an IPSE member, Phil Winfield, company Primary Pass Limited. You can look this up. This was my first ever IR35 tribunal that I went to, somewhere in Russell Square or something. We had a 2-day tribunal with a PCG member, which we supported through the case, and we won the case. It was a case that went on for about 7 years or something, the investigation. It was terrible for Phil, really, really stressful. but that was a GSK case as well. So HMRC has always had a bit of a thing for GSK. There's obviously always been a lot of contractors at GSK, and now I think GSK, they know they're under the spotlight. HMRC are always looking at them, so they've taken this really, really strict view, which is very, very disappointing. You know, the contractors that they've used and have stood by them so well over the years, GSK is now sort of like turned their backs on them because they're frightened of HMRC. I'd like to see GSK actually pushing back and saying, no, we're going to continue to use contractors and we're going to continue to put them outside of IR35. And if you've got a problem with the HMRC, let's go to court. That's what I'd like to see. But yeah, Ian, I'm aware that's what they're doing there. So it's depressing. But again, see, I think the GSKs of this world may well change their view over time. I think they may well actually say we need more contractors back. All our contractors are leaving us. This fixed term contract model doesn't work so well. Let's try and get our heads around this legislation and go back to using contractors. That's my hope, Ian. But GSK have a sort of almost special relationship with HMRC when it comes to IR35. I would say that. Amrit, one of our regular watchers, says a few agencies I know are looking at statement of work, but they aren't sure how it will work just yet. I think that's right, Amrit. I think that's exactly right. Statement of work, there's a lot of questions around this. Is it really a way to demonstrate that IR35 does not apply? Will HMRC accept that as it is? Will it work commercially as well as a contract, as a way of organising the project? It won't necessarily do that in every case, but it's definitely interesting that people are looking at this. Ben said tried statement of work, but the client wouldn't have any of it. Yeah, exactly. I think this is exactly right. This is great feedback. Thanks very much for Ben and Amrit. I think that this is right. No one's quite sure what to do at the moment. I think clients are just, some of them are just saying not having any of it. You know, like we heard before from, I think it was Alan who said contracted out service thing. No, not having any of it. Just, I'm terrified of HMRC. I'm totally confused by these IR35 rules. Everyone get on the payroll. You know, that's the only way that I want to proceed here. And my hope is that over time, some of these things will keep coming back in, and we're going to keep on trying to find ways to arrange affairs that works for everyone, including HMRC. Because as I say, HMRC don't believe that every engagement out there is caught by IR35. You know, so there will be ways that we can sort this out. We just need to get the clients on board with that message as well. And I hope that commercial necessity will push them towards exploring these alternative avenues. How are we doing for time? We've gone over time a little bit. Any other questions you've noticed that we should talk about?
Leading on from your little talk on the future of contracting, Rachel is asking, how long do you think it would take for more clients to stop taking a risk-averse approach? 12 months, 18 months? How long did it take in the public sector?
Yeah, it's a good question actually, Rachel. There was a bit of a softening of approach in the public sector over time, but interestingly, I think because these rules are coming in the private sector now, the public sector are starting to tighten it up again as well. There's a bit more of a sort of like microscope on this whole area, and I've heard from people who are working in the public sector that all of a sudden their public sector client is saying IR35 applies, and it's almost as if the public sector client had sort of taken their eye off the ball before, hadn't really said anything about it, but now they are. Of course, the public sector there are some changes in the public sector too. The whole SDS thing is new in the public sector as it is in the private sector. Before, they didn't have to do that. They just had to explain down the supply chain, but now they've got to give an SDS to the contractor. So there's a lot of that going on as well. So it's causing a stir there. But how long do I think? Look, I don't know, Rachel, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, you know, we should be more pessimistic than I'm being. But I think that in about a year's time, you're going to start to see more and more outside of IR35 contracts being advertised. I think that's what you're going to see. I think that clients are going to start to live with the risk of this a bit more, and actually put things in place which diminish that risk. So maybe a year, maybe 18 months time, we'll start to see a softening of approach, and maybe in 3 or 4 years time, we're going to be back to something like we were before. But one thing we probably won't have which has to be actually a good thing. And many of you will know, because you're experienced contractors, that there are some people who were sort of, working inside IR35 as sort of permanent contractors, actually kind of like taking the mickey a little bit and making life worse for real contractors that are out there, because it's because of those guys that are in this mess in the first place. So I think that these rules might actually sort them out, and they won't be able to contract in that way anymore. But genuine, proper contractors will be able to contract again, I hope. That's my hope. It's one of the galling things about these rules, and the government don't really say this so much anymore, is when the government used to say genuinely self-employed people won't be affected by this rule change. And you used to think thousands of them are being affected. How can you say that when the banks are now saying they're not going to use contractors anymore? And I said this directly to Jesse Norman at the beginning of last year when we had a meeting, and he did seem to potentially sort of half take this on. And I have heard the government saying that line a bit less since then, so maybe that did get through. It didn't change the policy though. But the idea that genuine contractors aren't impacted by this is clearly ludicrous and used to get me quite angry. Still does. Maybe we should leave it there, unless there's anything else you've seen, Josh, that we could quickly answer.
There was a quick question about working abroad. So Jim's asking, he's been contracting direct to a client in the US and working from home, but their UK presence has determined that the rules apply even though his contract is the US side. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is, unfortunately, yeah. So overseas clients, the rules work like this. If your client is wholly overseas with no UK branch or subsidiary or office, then IR35 doesn't, well, it does apply, but it's your business, it's your PSC, so sorry to use that made up term, it's your limited company that has the responsibility for IR35, just like it always has done and still does today, but won't do this time next month. If, however, the overseas client has a UK subsidiary, then the UK subsidiary can be held liable for that and has to issue an SDS. And so in this instance, that's what's happening here. Now, obviously, the UK subsidiary probably has no idea whether IR35 should apply or not. So I would recommend that you challenge that with evidence as to why it doesn't apply. I mean, I think that if your client is in the US and you're in the UK working from home, there's probably quite a strong case to say that you have a high degree, of autonomy over the work that you do. So you might be able to convince them of that. But it is there's technically, there's nothing wrong with the way that that's happened under the legislation, I'm afraid to say. Look, I think we better leave it there. Look, thanks very much for joining us. There's masses of questions as always. I know we haven't got round to it. I mean, Stanislav was asking about the Uber case as well, and whether or not that. I think the question was, I haven't got it in front of me, Stanislav, but I think your question was, is the next battleground for IR35 actually on employment rights? And is the Uber case going to sort of mean that clients won't put people inside IR35 because it will mean necessarily that they will have employment rights? Look, I think that there is something going on here with the Uber case and that judgment of the Supreme Court and what that could mean for IR35 cases. I do think so, but the way that the supply chain works with the umbrella companies coming in there, because then the contractor becomes a quasi-employee of the umbrella company, it all makes it a bit difficult. But I spoke to another expert on this earlier this week, someone called David Kirk, who is from the ICAEW and someone who I've known for a long time, and he believes that the Uber case could have an impact on this, but he suspects it will take a few years for it to weave its way through the system before we begin to understand the implications of that. But it might be nice to get David on this webinar at some stage, actually, to talk about some of these things. But anyway, we didn't have time to talk about that here today, Stanislav, but we will talk about it in the future. I'm planning to do one where we talk more about things like these cases and these problems with the whole world of self-employment and what these rulings mean and where we're going with this whole thing. So look out for that in the future. We're doing a webinar next week on umbrella working, so do tune into that if that's of interest to you. And thanks very much for tuning in here again. And I'm sorry that I haven't had time to get to everyone's questions, but we do look at them afterwards and we do use them to help us come up with future content. So thanks very much. Cheers, and thanks to Josh. Thanks, Josh. Okay,
Thanks.
thanks. Bye. Bye-bye.